Welcome to Insights in Sound, where we talk to the people behind the scenes, behind the technology, and behind the music. People you may not know, but you should.
My guest is Jonathan Wyner. He is the chief engineer at MWorks Mastering, a professor at Berklee College of Music, director of education for Isotope, and the current president of AES, and probably a whole bunch of other titles that I'm not aware of.
No, thank you. I've got enough. Thank you, bartender. I've had one too many.
No more slashes in your title, eh?
But, you know, it really is all one thing.
Of course it is. Of course it is. And that's one thing that I like to get into with a lot of my guests, and it's certainly applicable to you. It comes from my own personal experience too. I believe that the days of people having a career are more or less a thing of the past. I think for most of us, we follow a career path that kind of winds through a number of different careers and disciplines in our lives.
Right.
And, you know, I've always said I'm a fan of sort of allowing the road to illuminate as I walk on it, you know, and that seems to be the case with you as well. So let's start at the very beginning.
Okay.
Tell me a little bit about your early background. I assume your early background is musical.
It is musical. In fact, you know, it seems like it was sort of preordained in that, although my brother might have a different story to tell, but I came from a family that was a family of artists. On my father's side, it was a family of musicians, mostly classical pedigree, Yiddish art songs, and so on and so forth. So both my father, my uncle, my grandfather, you know, music was in the air. My mother was an art teacher. I didn't get any of that. And so, you know, I was introduced to I actually think I spoke the musical language before I spoke, you know, English.
So was there formal training involved, or was it just
I was taking music lessons when I was 4, and it was just always around.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, for me, there was kind of no other choice than to figure out a life in and around music.
Mm-hmm.
Which was incredibly daunting because I saw, you know, my uncle in particular was enormously, and still is enormously successful as a musician. And yet I saw that it wasn't easy for him. And, you know, I compared myself to him and thought, well, I'll never get to be that good. So how's this going to work? So, you know, I was bitten by the technology bug as a teenager, you know, plugging in guitars to guitar amplifiers and doing crazy things with the guitars and turning up the reverb and the tremolo with my friends in the bedroom, like just improvising and playing. And got introduced to a slightly more formal version of that in my music classes in high school. And then in college, there was no such thing as an audio education program when I was in college.
Of course.
You know, this was pre that. In fact, I don't think anybody really thought of audio engineer as a real profession unless you were in radio or out on tour with a band, and that was questionable.
Right. Most of us ended up doing things like getting a first-class FCC license and training with a bunch of people who wanted to go into radio.
Well, right. So I got my third class.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I got my third class FCC license, and so that was, you know, and I got a hold of tape machines and synthesizers and started.
Oh, then it's all over. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well,
so that was, yeah.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because that's one of the things that I'm always interested in, especially with people like us who have a technical background as well, because in learning an instrument, for example, there's a lot of left brain, right brain balance there, because on the one hand, you have to have the left brain, you know, training for the instrument. On the other, you have to have sort of a right brain improvisational nature. And that is also true with a lot of technical people. However, in both cases, you know, we all know musicians, for example, who can't play without a piece of sheet music in front of them. ask them to improvise and they panic, you know. And there are a lot of engineers who are similarly aligned in terms of their familiarity with technology versus an understanding of it. And that's why I'm always fascinated by people who go into our particular segment of the industry, because there is a lot of that mix. And it seems like that's what you have also experienced in your life.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's a marriage of, you know, you develop a vocabulary of experience, and there's empirical sort of learning that comes along with the interface with technology. You sort of figure out what it does and how to work with it and how to work to it. And, you know, by repetition, I mean, I was never a very good sort of, you know, book learner. I was sort of the learn by doing sort, you know, and so after enough cycles, you develop a relationship with the tools and the information that you get back and the feedback loop that comes about. So whether it's, I mean, I started out playing piano, but I ended up playing French horn. That was my major in college, which was a terrible mistake.
Interesting.
Terrible mistake. But that's a weird piece of technology that I had to figure out. I had to sort of learn what this thing does, you know, these valves and my hand in the bell and the sort of embouchure and getting the right pitch and staying in tune, which I never did very well.
Well, the other thing about those type of instruments, and I speak from my own experience as primarily a bass player as well, is that there's instruments that are monophonic, so to speak. I think there's a certain consciousness that one has to develop in relation to the other musicians, the ensemble playing thing. Whereas, you know, you have a lot of, let's say, keyboardists and guitarists who are perfectly content with being solo. And because they can be solo, they don't necessarily think about that bigger picture.
Yeah. I started out on piano. I play piano, but I'm with you in your observation is correct. As a role player, a team player, I mean, there's nothing like being in a band or like being in an orchestra and everybody is pointing in the same direction, you know, landing on the downbeat, hopefully at the same time, balancing themselves in that same moment. It is exhilarating.
It is. Yeah. And the improvisation that goes with it, especially in I mean, not necessarily in an orchestral session, but in any kind of a rock band setting or anything like that, you know, there's an energy that happens between people, that give and take of playing together in an ensemble fashion. I think, to me, I think of it as almost akin to falling in love in a certain way, you know.
I think I understand.
Well, you know, you feed off each other's energy, and
yes.
You know, there's these moments that you have, you know. For me, I know that there have been certain musical relationships that I've had with others where, you know, you just have these moments when you're playing together, you improvise together, and you just, you know, everybody, as you say, the energy is all there, everybody's flowing in the same direction, and, you know, you lock eyeballs with somebody and you just go, yeah. You know?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the things that's wonderful about music, is that I think this is how I relate to this, like falling in love analogy. It is sort of it's not verbal. It's sort of super, you know, it's a different mode of communication.
Exactly.
It is vibrations in the air, like literally. Mm-hmm. And we're interacting with this thing that's like ephemeral and like clay, and we're molding it, and it takes different shapes, but it's not bounded by, you know, literal, like, you know, meaning like you have with words or like you have with visual images. I mean, of course, those can be malleable in other ways and other formats, but that to me is it's the closest thing for me that I'll get to like a spiritual kind of experience.
Yeah, I would say that as well. There's definitely it's a much deeper connection that we have, and sometimes we even have it, you know, as solo artists. But I think the energy that comes through when you're in an ensemble situation like that can sometimes be just so, as you say, spiritual, exhilarating. It's just, there's nothing like it.
Yeah. Yeah. I would love if, to give everybody the chance to experience that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So now you started talking a little bit about your technical experimentation and everything. And, that's always been interesting to me as well, because for me personally, those things have converged and diverged in various forms and during my life, being an engineer, being a producer, being an educator, there are ways that one influences the other, just the same way the left brain feeds the right and vice versa. How did that impact your work? I mean, you obviously at some point or another you veered towards more of a technical bent, at least in your professional work, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think that was going back to your earlier comment about the long and winding road that makes up a career. A lot of the time it was in response to opportunities. So, it's like, or a desire to like learn how to operate equipment in a studio. You sort of have to, for a moment, you have to put aside the creative part of your brain and figure out just like, what do all these buttons do? And, what's in the channel strip? Or, certainly as a mastering engineer in the early days of digital, there was a lot of that like deep dive into the technology and into clocking and early on it was like a magic trick that we could even make digital work at all, but it required that kind of technical discipline and investigation. But even at that, after a while, you can't help yourself but say, okay, so now I've got these things, so how can I make it misbehave, or how can I do something interesting? Once you've got the enough of the technology under your fingertips, so that you can start to play.
Sure. And that's applicable to musicians as well, I think.
Yeah, that's exactly. Well, that's right. And I don't think I'm being sort of overly reductive in sort of saying that. I think they really are, at least for me, they're the same thing. Like I'll take a really deep dive into like how circuits behave, or the difference between a minimum phase and a linear phase EQ, and how it differs from the standpoint of physics or signal processing. But really what I'm after is the play, is the difference in the color, or how it's sort of shaping waves that result in a different feeling. So it all sort of comes back to that for me.
Sure, it makes sense. I mean, I know that in the process of learning engineering, I know for me as well as for many other people that I've spoken with, part of it is really learning a piece of gear so that you can, first of all, break some of those rules. But, again, you treat those tools, whether it's a compressor or EQ or whatever it is, you treat them as instruments, and in that way, you try and not only explore, but completely go beyond their boundaries.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this is the thing I'm always in search of, is the performance aspect of what I do. And sort of that, that ability to sort of be intuitive and to respond to whatever's coming at me. So that's actually one of the things that drives me crazy about, these things, about mice and keyboards, is that it's harder to be, in the performance mode, at least for me. I know like Berkeley actually considers a laptop as an instrument that one can major on, and I'm sure that there are people for whom they've kind of mapped the interface, so it is their instrument. I've just never gotten there.
Yeah, I can understand that, and I think I've noticed that, for example, if I travel with my laptop and I don't have all of my accoutrements with me,
Right.
whatever it is, my little interface tools, because I am indeed playing it in that sense,
Right.
like an instrument. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk about mastering a little bit, because you started to get into that, and especially I would say pre-digital and even in the early days of digital, we always kind of thought of it as a black art. Most of us, both musicians and even regular recording engineers, quote unquote, we kind of raised an eyebrow at you guys, and we're like, okay, yeah, you're gonna sprinkle some of your magic sauce on it. What drew you to that particular discipline?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I wasn't drawn to it. It was a door that opened in front of me, and I walked through it. Um, when I started as a mastering engineer, it was just at the advent of digital,
Uh-huh.
and particularly the CD. And what that, in the early days of digital, like just getting two channels to work was hard enough. So, like, multi-track engineers weren't really, I mean, except in rare instances, they couldn't afford the digital machines, and the machines weren't really capable of
And
what
they
they
sounded
needed.
like shit. I'm sorry, but the first generation of digital multitracks.
Yeah, that's a whole other topic, but
Yeah.
I hear you. But so it was, so this came into the world of the mastering engineer first.
Uh-huh.
And mastering represented a chance to learn about this new technology that seemed like magic. And this door opened. I was like, okay, I'll do that. Let me check that out. Um, the other the other thing that I found particularly attractive about it, I was a producer and a recording and mixing engineer before I became a mastering engineer, which I think was helpful training and context. But I was doing late night sessions. I was, for every record that I worked on that I enjoyed, I was working on 10 records that I was like, these are demos. These people are sort of just working it out.
Oh
As a
God,
mastering
do I know you?
engineer,
Yeah.
well, as a mastering engineer, every record was release quality. I mean, it kind
Uh,
of had to be back then because it was expensive to master something and
sure.
expensive to manufacture something. And so, like, the level of the project, the quality of the project on average that I was working on went from here to like here. I was like, well, this is cool. It's more fun to spend time with better records. Um, and there's a trade-off because you can do things in recording you can't do in mastering. You're not
Sure.
usually
Sure.
not going to add a guitar solo in mastering, although I had to do that once, but usually not.
But it's the other thing about it is that when you start talking about the whole ensemble thing, mastering is pretty much a solo gig.
Yeah, that's right.
You don't have that energy. You're basically in a very highly analytical mode.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the solo. The analytical part for me when I'm mastering, it's like the room, everything disappears. And it is really just sort of me and the sound in the room that so I tend to not be so much in that analytical part of my brain, but it is a very solitary experience.
I mean, I would
And
I
that,
would argue that, because I see what you're saying, that it does become sort of intuitive, but at the same time, isn't it by its very nature an intuitive art form that is very analytical? I mean, you have to be really immersing yourself in the sound of the music to be able to say, oh, I think that needs to come up a little bit, or this needs whatever it is. I mean,
yeah,
again, maybe it comes down to what we were just talking about learning it to the point where it becomes second nature.
yeah, I think that's right. I think when you're practicing it, you do have to be analytical. It's like, oh, that needs more top end, and I got to figure out how to understand what that means and recognize it. But in your description, I don't know if you've ever conducted an orchestra,
I have not.
but in a way, for me, it's like the experience of being a conductor. I've only done it a few times in my life, where in a moment you sort of have to know what is supposed to happen, but you have to figure out what's happening and try to sort of make the next thing happen that that you want to have happen.
I've done that with bands as a producer.
Yeah, so for me, there's a way in which mastering is very much the same experience, albeit solitary. So I mean, back to your sort of black art comment before, and this is something I struggle with, partly on behalf of, I'm a teacher, so I have to figure out a way to make it seem less like a black art, and also on behalf of my students who want to learn it. And while it's kind of nice for people to walk around thinking that you have a magic wand and a magic like cloak, I really ultimately think it is only a black art to people who don't do it every day.
Sure.
I mean, and so I think that if you did it every day after, you satisfy Malcolm Gladwell's requirement, you get 5 years under your belt, it's no longer a black art.
Sure. And in a sense, I could see where having other people perceive it as a black art could actually be frustrating.
It's a little bit dangerous, frankly, because sometimes people are reluctant to really engage. It's like, well, you must know, this black art and you must know what's right. And you don't always get honest commentary, honest feedback, or honest collaboration with people, because people are intimidated by the mastering engineer.
It's interesting also. I had a conversation with I have a lot of conversations with one particular good friend of mine who's produced a number of very successful albums. And we were talking about this one particular record of his that was actually mastered by, I think, 3 or 4 different people. And he's very much an analog purist, or was. I don't know that he still is, but a lot in his recording process, a lot goes into the actual recording process in terms of sonics, not just the interface with the artist, but actually, like, let's get a really, really great, amazing bass sound, drum sound, all of that stuff. And he mentioned to me at one point that, this particular record went out to a number of different mastering engineers, and he'd listen to it, and then like a day or 2 later, he'd feel like, nah, it's not really getting it. And I think that must be again, a kind of a frustrating experience, because you don't have that immediate feedback.
Right. Well, you mean for the mastering engineers, it's frustrating?
Well, for the mastering engineer, as well as for those who are employing them. Right. Because you don't know what they're doing. So therefore, how can you accurately judge whether or not you like what they're doing?
Right. Well, I mean, so you talk about it, right? And you communicate. I mean, there are a few things that brings to mind. First of all, my favorite way of working is to have somebody send me something when it's 80% of the way done, to sort of start to engage in the conversation before they've crossed the finish line, so we develop some vocabulary together.
And so that they can hopefully head off a few things and make a few things readier for you, so to speak, right?
That's one of the potential benefits, but also I can learn what's driving their decisions, and what they're about. The other thing is, just last week, I had somebody call me and ask me if I'd finished the record yet, because they needed it tomorrow and I hadn't received the audio. I mean, and that's a way of saying, and this has happened like a half a dozen times, in my career, but it doesn't, people are usually under these ridiculous deadlines, and, the recording gets pushed back and the mixing gets pushed back. And of course they've set the release date here. So it's like a fast moving train, and here's the wall, and oh, by the way, here's mastering. And so we don't always give ourselves the luxury of taking that time. And then of course there's the sort of economics built into it. It's like, which, you know, people don't like to sort of spend a lot of time thinking about spending money, but you know, if you're going to ask somebody to master something 3 or 4 times and master it differently, you better have a good understanding going in what the implications of that are. So those are all sort of different takes on that idea. But I've worked with some people who, even if they're not technically savvy, their hearing and their sensibility is so acute that they can describe something that they'd like to hear a little bit differently, and we get across the finish line together.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are some people who hand me stuff that just sounds so good that I can't make it better.
Now, that's something I would love to hear. You know, I'd love to hear that everybody's capable of making a recording that good that it doesn't need any help. But, you know, circling back to your point, though, the less understanding that an artist or an engineer, producer, whomever has about the process of mastering, the less happy they're going to be about spending money on it.
Yeah, or at least more confused they're going to be.
Yeah, it's like,
why
I don't get it.
Why do I have to do this?
Yeah.
Right.
So that must be kind of frustrating in a way, to just, you know, again, you know, describing your job to somebody who really doesn't understand what it is.
Yeah. There's so many takes on that, so many different versions of that. You know, there are those versions where people, you know, they hear the results and it's made a transformative difference for them, where they feel like they're, you know, we've revealed something about their music.
Mm-hmm.
And that's so gratifying. And they're like, oh, I get it. But there are those instances where, you know, just needs a little bit of level, a little bit of top end, you know. Fortunately, those are the gigs where the invoice is lower. There's just not that much time spent. So they're happy about that, but they're like, well, did you do anything? And it's like, well, what did you want me to do? I mean, you have a great sounding record here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's a little weird.
Yeah, I could see that.
But, you know, I think as people get along in their careers, I mean, for anybody who's made more than 1 or 2 records, you begin to understand where mastering lives in the chain,
mm-hmm.
in the production chain. And there are things that we take care of that, you know, other people don't want to, or other people are glad that we're taking care of, like setting levels, like making sure there's nothing screwed up, like, you know, making sure that the spelling of their tracks is correct. I mean, all of this like detail that you don't, you know, most people when they start make their first recording, they never think about how that gets to be. Like, how does that happen?
Oh yeah,
never thought about that.
In fact, you know, one of my early gigs as a second engineer opened my eyes to the fact that, oh shit, I'm the guy who's supposed to be documenting everything right now, you know. And you know, it came back to me later on as an understanding of, you know, receiving somebody's half-done masters as we're, you know, in a session, and saying, okay, well, you know, what did you do here? Oh, it's not documented, you know. Right. So these are things that, again, you know, you don't necessarily learn firsthand. I mean, that's, you know, and that goes back to a much wider conversation that I know you and I have had, and I've had with a number of people regarding the opportunities to actually learn in a recording session, you know, quote unquote. I mean, there are so many things that you can teach. I mean, you can teach someone how to use a compressor. You can even teach them how to document. But, you know, there's a lot about just the basic interaction, the psychology, when to keep your mouth shut, you know, things like that, how to keep the energy level going, you know, and those are things that really, I think, they probably can be taught, but they're not taught in a classroom. They're really taught in real life situations, you know. And I think for those of us who were fortunate enough to, you know, be a fly on the wall and stand in the back in the corner and watch some of these experienced producers work, you know, I took a lot of that with me, you know, and I remember specifically having a session where I was trying to inspire a drummer to do a certain thing. And I literally stood in front of his kit and I was jumping up and down like a goddamn gorilla, you know, and, you know, we had this conversation in the control room later on with the rest of his band, and they were all laughing about it. And, you know, and I said, yeah, actually, you know, I learned that from watching other producers
Right.
do the same thing. And this is something that, you know, you might not necessarily pick up initially.
Right. Yeah. And I'm still learning. I mean,
We all are. Yeah.
we're fortunate at school to have a lot of visiting artists come through, and a lot of them are A-lists, and we have sessions that they do in front of students, but the students are just observing, and, you know, like, oh, that is a brilliant idea.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
but, you know, even more than the technique, I think for me, the interaction with the artist and to sort of create the environment for people to be creative and to feel encouraged and to feel comfortable, that is like the underlying skill. You know, Phil Ramone was just a genius.
He absolutely was. He was actually one of the people I had in mind when I was just saying that, because I was fortunate enough to watch a couple of his sessions. And
I was actually observing a session at the power station a long time ago with him, and the assistant engineer totally screwed up and punched in the wrong place, wiped out something that should not have been wiped out. And Phil Ramone made everybody just feel like everything was great, didn't say anything. At the end of the session, the assistant engineer had a good talking to, but he was able to just maintain this sort of feeling of encouragement, and it was positive, and I was just kind of blown away by his ability to do that.
Yeah, he was very good at that. Another one who was really, really good at that is Don Was.
Oh yeah.
You know, I watching Don work was another really, it just revelatory to me in certain ways, because again, you know, a lot of it is really, it's human psychology.
Yeah.
You know, and it's just, as you say, creating that environment where people feel just relaxed and open to the whole creative flow. And that's, you know, I think that's a skill that's not so easily taught.
Yeah.
You know, it's by observation more than anything else.
I'm laughing because my least favorite comment from people about mastering is they feel like when they walk into the mastering room, it's like going to the dentist's office, because they're just sitting in a chair waiting to find out. It's, you know, anyway. We have our techniques for helping them understand that we're appreciative and enjoying their work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's circle back on something, because, you know, we were talking about technology. You were talking about being in, you know, sort of in at the ground floor with digital. Now, we don't even have to get into how technology has changed the whole recording process. I mean, you know, from multi-tracking through having an undo key, you know, all of those things, you know, because both of us did come up during that era where you used a razor blade, you know, and so the technology itself has definitely changed the way we work. Mm-hmm. How is that? And I know, you know, especially for you, because you've been involved with companies like Isotope, for example, who, you know, they're everybody's darling, except when they've done something that pisses people off, you know, and that can be said about almost every company. But, you know, a lot of their tools, for example, have, one of the arguments I've heard is that, and I won't specifically pick on Isotope here, because there are plenty of other companies who are equally guilty of this.
Feel free.
Well, you know, what I think is interesting is, with the advent of things like artificial intelligence and, you know, just what we can do in terms of digitizing things at this point, how has that changed things for you in terms of not just the way you work, but the way you teach?
Oh, well, I mean, so technology there is always a double-edged sword. It gives us some things, and like the grid is problematic, right?
Yep. Yep.
When you want to teach feel, right? Or make a recording with feel. And it's only in the last 10 years that the grid has even been at all merciful or accommodating.
It's true.
Although
Quantized drums, anyone? Yeah.
yeah, although, there were some great like 8-bit, records made in the 1980s that were fun,
Absolutely.
that were on the grid. So, so like I said, it offers some things and other things are maybe not so great. Um, New technology, offers some really interesting creative possibilities and new options and new insights. I mean, by being able to, like, if you look at a spectrogram and you look at an FFT of a signal, like you can with RX or spectral layers or any of these software tools, you can get insights that we never had before about what makes up the sound.
Sure.
And ways of manipulating them because of the insights that we never could do before. And it's really fun. And sometimes, it's like auto-tune is people love to hate on it, but of course there's the Cher record that, became like this, or, a T-Pain
Yeah.
record or whatever. I mean,
Every hip hop album, every hip hop record that's come out in the last few years.
Yeah, so it's got creative applications, and also there are times that we wish it didn't exist and wish that we didn't have to use it, except it allows us to get what the artist wants, or at least an approximation of it. So, I really draw a line from, electronic music all the way through MIDI, through buffers and limiters and multi-track digital machine. I mean, there's like this whole line of inventions.
Sure.
That bring about this sort of double-edged paradigm. And so we're in a moment like that, and probably we'll have another moment like that next week. I mean, it's all changing so quickly.
Yeah. Right? I think that moment has existed since Les Paul started messing with multi-track. Yeah. Actually,
I try to stay committed to thinking about the possibilities, that and looking out for the pitfalls, because there are pitfalls.
Oh yeah.
Like, our current version of any machine learned anything doesn't offer the same quality of control and fidelity that the last version of digital signal processing did. It may at some point, but if we just sort of adopt the new technology because it's cool and different without recognizing the trade-off, we're going to do work that's inferior. So you sort of got to understand where the limitations are and where the bodies are buried. But if we complain about everything that's new under the sun, you run the risk of being left behind, and you miss the possibility of collaborating with people who are doing new and interesting things. So I really enjoy the sort of the bleeding edge.
I would have to agree with you, and yeah, you're right. It is double-edged because on the one hand, you can argue that it allows lesser talented individuals to have a seat at the table that maybe they wouldn't have had at one point. On the other hand, as you say, it allows people to use those as tools and as instruments. The Farfisa
organ did the same thing.
It's true.
I mean, I hear what you're saying, and maybe people are talented in different ways or with different things.
Sure.
I mean, the physical dexterity required to play a violin is very different from the dexterity required to manipulate a machina connected to Ableton. One sort of more performance, sort of pure performance. The other I would submit is a little bit more like collage and sound design, but there's a performance aspect to that too. So I don't know. I try to steer really clear, like the moral stance around this stuff, but I understand that sometimes people get upset about.
Well, and you can get down to, for example, I have a lot of synthesizer playing friends. And, you know, there's the age old argument there of, you know, should I be using a modular versus, you know, just picking a preset, you know? And
Right.
again, you know, on the one hand, you can bitch and whine about, you know, people not learning their craft. On the other hand, you know, if I'm looking to complete a track, I'm just looking for a specific sound. Hey, you know, number 43 works just great right here, you know, and
Yeah.
maybe I'll tweak the envelope a little bit or something like that. But for the most part, it really is a matter of, you know, what do you do with that technology, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, don't you think, you know, after the 700th time picking model, you know, preset 43, that, you know, you're like, what about 44? Or what if I take 43 and a half? Or if I blend, I mean, I
Yep.
think
Yep.
eventually people are inspired to level up, to dive deeper, to sort of develop themselves. Otherwise, I mean, you don't have to, but then it becomes kind of like the Bob Ross school of, you know,
Paint by
music
numbers.
production.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah, it
fine.
does. It does. And as you say, I mean, it really, I think, you know, to a certain extent, it does sort of separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, you know, because there are plenty of people who can, you know, open up a laptop and say, yo, I'm in the studio, you know, and pull up a bunch of beats and everything. And that's great. Now, you know, is there a possibility that some of those people will evolve into true artists? Absolutely, you know, and who's to say what art is? You know, I mean, obviously, we're all going to define that in our own terms. At the same time, there has always been this traditional sort of backlash of, you know, well, if you know, if he could sing, he wouldn't need auto tune, and you know, if you were a decent drummer, we wouldn't need to quantize and fix all your drums and all of that. And you know, really, I think one has to evaluate that on a case by case basis, right? I mean, you know, I remember talking to a friend of mine who was working on a remix of a disco tune from the 70s. And in fact, the tune was Brick House.
Oh yeah,
Remember it?
yeah,
And he said, you know, I figured because that was, you know, done during the disco era, that it was going to be easy to just lay out on the grid. He said, man, the rhythm on that is all over the map.
right.
You know, it slows down, it speeds up. And that's interesting because, you know, we didn't hear it at the time, you know, and for what it is, it's a fantastic track. There's no doubt about it. Everybody knows it, you know, because it's the performance. It's the ultimate, it's ultimately the entire performance that gets you, you know,
Right.
and that's always the case. And, you know, we both know that from working with artists. It really, it has more to do with the actual character of the entire performance, whether it's, you know, the personality of the vocal itself or whatever
Yeah.
it is. I mean, it really, it has more to do with that than it does with any particular tool.
Yeah. I mean, you know, it's how you evaluate and what the criteria is that you use to evaluate something. It's like, is it on the grid, or what is the whole thing, and how does it put together? You know, as you were saying that, it reminded me how much the aesthetics around music have changed.
Yeah.
And in response to technology.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, before there was a grid, you couldn't, well, we had step sequencers actually before the grid. I remember working on an Electrocomp 101 step sequencer in the 70s. It was, you know, 8 boops. That's all you got. That was your pattern.
Yep. Exactly.
But anyway, you could, you know, you get my point, is that just didn't even exist, and now it does, and so people play with that. And you know, the possibilities now are wholly different from what they were before.
Oh yeah. And even, you know, now even more so, because now you literally have the ability for someone to phone in their part,
Yes.
you know, and
I'm
therefore
I'm phoning in this interview.
there you go. Exactly. You know, but you know, doesn't that influence it? I mean, you know, I've been asked to send somebody bass parts, you know, and that's great. It's wonderful. It's fun. I'm so glad I can do that and, you know, put together a track with people all over the world and stuff like that. At the same time, we know that that's not going to be the same energy as if I'm standing in the same room right next to the drummer.
That's right.
You know, and
That's
so
right.
it
And that
does. It
real,
impacts. Yeah, it impacts the entire creative process.
yeah.
And how do you
There's
teach
another,
that?
how do you teach it?
Yeah, how do you teach that? I mean,
I think the only way you can really teach that is by letting someone experience it. I don't, I, you know, I've learned so much by being next to somebody and watching them work and listening to them work, because then I saw what was possible. And only until then did they unlock this idea that's like, oh, you can make something sound like that. You can do that kind of crossfade. You could do that punch in. They sort of they open up a new universe and a new universe of possibilities. And that's mentorship, and that's just the advantage of sort of being with people who are on that level. And it's hard to really sort of understand that without being in the presence of it. And I don't know how. I mean, we've done a lot to try to sort of replace the idea of mentorship in that way, by creating videos or by creating sort of mentorship over distance, but it's harder.
it is harder, and to a certain extent, you don't know. When you talk about that experience, there's almost a magical moment that happens when, as I want to say a student, and it's not necessarily officially a student, but as students of life, as you say, we're all still always learning. I know that there have been certain moments in my life when I've just had a revelation by watching someone. And, that can be in a technical level. It can be in a psychological level, working in the studio. It can even be on a musical level, just watching somebody play a riff and thinking, ooh, that's a nice riff, watching their fingers or whatever. Those are learning experiences that we have. And yeah, it's probably different having those experiences remotely as opposed to having them in the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's got to impact your educational process, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes you end up, I do, when I'm teaching in person, I work in front of the students. Because that's, and it's hard sometimes to not feel like you're supposed to be talking to them all the time. But invariably, when I do that, they appreciate it afterwards. They're like, I'm so glad you did that, because I understand some things I didn't understand before. There's something on my mind. I'm just going to say it out loud because I keep being distracted by the thought. And I think you brought it up by inference a couple of times about what's different, what's changed over time. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is it's sort of two things. The way people come in contact with new music has changed dramatically. When you and I were younger, the filters for what we heard, it was either what was happening down the street or at a concert, or it was the major labels and maybe the New York Times.
Yeah.
And so everybody sort of shared a common experience around music and musical vocabulary, for better or worse. But there was this sort of shared experience, and it was the bar was set differently, and it was kind of a gated experience, but there was a common vocabulary.
There weren't the silos that we have now. Agreed. Yeah.
Well, and now it's just like, it's so hard to know where to look and what and how to share conversations around music. I bet you what you listened to in the last week is different from what I listened to, and 30 years ago that wouldn't be the case. And there's an economic component to that too, whereas there were fewer people who were able to make like a middle class living with music because of those filters were sort of narrower.
There's also a marketing component to it.
Yeah.
Because if you think about it, anything that you hear at this point has had some kind of marketing behind it, whether it's just word of mouth from your buddies, or whether it's somebody paying to promote through Spotify or on YouTube or whatever it is. that's the only way you can really break through, because there is such segmentation at this point.
Yeah, yeah. So it's interesting. I haven't done a lot of I haven't drawn any conclusions about how that's influenced the aesthetic of what's going on, or how it's affecting the sort of the culture and the music in the culture. But I do know it's had a pretty significant effect on the economy around music.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And so anyway, just now I've said it.
No, and it's a really good point, because as we see, there are definitely fewer people going into music, and they go into music for much different reasons now. I think, when I was coming up, I mean, okay, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a rock star, didn't we all, but even beyond that, when I got older, I wanted to be a producer, and I wanted to be a producer because of the impact that certain musical productions had on me and on my life. And I don't know that that's necessarily the case for as many people now, because music itself has become much more of a background.
There's a commodification to it.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I just was afraid that somebody was going to ask me to do something else, because I didn't know what else I would do.
That's pretty much the case with me as well, and it's, I mean, I was telling someone about this the other day, when I was younger, my parents always said, have a real job to fall back on. And, I actually had a real job at one point. I've had very few
waiting tables.
No, actually, I was a technician for the phone company for a few years.
Right.
And in fact, that turned out to be an absolute disaster. And, most of my life has been in the music industry, for better or worse, and, mostly better. I mean, I'm very, very happy that I've been able to be involved in such a creative industry, and such a different industry, and it's one thing, I mean, for many years, I have run a marketing and PR company. And again, that was sort of a learned discipline, when you talk about autodidactism, and is that a word?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good.
Didacticism?
Didactivism, whatever it is. Yes.
Just
being self-taught. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's, again, something that I did learn through doing, but at the same time, I think my big advantage going in was that I understood the very unique nature of the music industry. And, I see, especially nowadays, and I'm going to have a get off my lawn moment here, but, I speak with a lot of younger people who come into music marketing or technology marketing, and they're really great with statistics, and they're really great with understanding how social media works and all of that stuff. But what they don't really understand is the unique nature of the mindset of people who are in a creative discipline. And I think that is something that, to me, is, again, I don't know if you can teach that, but there's a certain understanding there of just, being able to talk to an artist or a creative individual. Yeah. And I think that's definitely unique to our industry.
I mean, it's critical. It's like you have to understand your audience. In essence, I think in the same way that, like, to master a record, I have to have some empathy for what it means to record a record.
Yeah.
And sort of have that sense, and understand what it means to perform. So I think it's an important part of the education. I think you're right. You can't just study analytics and expect to be able to do a good job understanding how to serve an artist.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think, to my mind, it comes across as almost disingenuous if you are approaching it from such an analytical point. And I don't mean that in a negative fashion. I'm not necessarily coming down on someone who approaches it in that level, but I think to a certain extent, it's kind of like we were talking about with, engineers, or even classically educated musicians who can't play without a chart in front of them, for example. I think there's a certain intuitiveness that one has to really engage with in order to understand beyond that rote technical aspect of it.
Yeah. Yeah. So what else you got for me, Daniel?
What else do I have?
That
for
seemed
you?
like such a great statement.
I don't know what to say next. Yeah. Well, the only other thing I wanted to ask you about, since you are so deeply involved with not only the educational aspect, but also, product, the development of these new technologies and products with your day job or one of your day jobs, what's next? What do you see on the horizon? I mean, I don't think that AI is going to take over making music or anything like that. But, now that we've talked about how things have changed, where do you see them going next?
Well, yeah, of course, nobody knows, so I can just make a bunch of stuff up.
Absolutely. That's what we're here for.
So I think and this is especially, I think, we sort of from the perspective of the mastering engineer, this is probably somewhere in here is embedded like the mastering engineer's worst fears. But I don't think it has to be. But I think that the notion of a fixed presentation of a performance is slowly going away. In other words, it used to be that there was the definitive mix, the definitive performance, the definitive version. We've seen that erode by remasters, remixes, remakes. The change in the way that the music is presented, it's no longer on a physical thing, but it can be disseminated via streaming. We've gone in broadcast from a scenario where you had a separate stereo mix to a fold down from 5.1. We're moving into immersive audio, multi-channel audio, dynamically responsive mixing engines, AI systems that can remix or unmix things. And people are just consuming music in a whole bunch of different contexts. And I think technology will drive the interaction to be sort of customized to the listener.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I was talking to someone recently who was talking about being able to create different versions of a performance where you could literally put yourself on stage and place yourself between the bass player and the drummer, or over on this part of the stage and things like that. And I think that again would be a similar sort of adaptation of that technology.
Yeah. And so that there's like a personalization that is possible, and a customization that I think there will probably always be a reason and a context within which just let me hear the song, the way it's been mixed, the way it's been whatever. But I think technology is opening up so many different possibilities that I think we have to let go a little bit of the idea of the single iconic presentation. That point of reference that everybody's going to say, yeah, I like the stereo mixes that came out in 1967. I think that's changing.
Yeah, or just I like the original recording of this better than the live version, or whatever it is. Yeah.
Everybody gets to have their own version.
Oh man. I don't know, that almost sounds like a nightmare in certain senses, but could be great, could be horrible, could be somewhere in between.
I think reality sort of gets parked somewhere in between.
Yeah, sounds like it. Cool. Jonathan Wyner, thank you for being my guest.
Daniel Liston Keller, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure, and I hope you make some great music tomorrow.
Hey, I'm Daniel Keller. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join us each week for Insights in Sound.